discussed this multiple times, that reward and punishment is a fundamental of Jewish belief. In Hebrew, it's referred to schar v'onish. Schar is reward, onish is punishment. Anything we do, as minor as major, if it has a positive value, you're rewarded. If it has negative, it has a consequence. The consequence is negative, which interprets itself as punishment. Because it brings about a diminishment. It either advances you or it causes a decline in the person. It compromises the person's reality. Now, at the end of last week's reading, we read, God says he pays his enemies in their lifetime. So when they pass away, they should go into the oblivion. Okay? Meaning, a person's truly evil. Even a person's truly evil, he did some good deeds in his life. Did something that he's worthy to be rewarded. He has no interest in the world to come because he doesn't believe in God. And God has no interest in him having a relationship with him. Because in his lifetime, the man has no compunction or no level of value of God. So God says, I wish you well, but not in the world to come. But a person has to be compensated for the good deed. So the Torah says, Mishalem l'sonav al panav. God pays his enemies in the lifetime, kedei lavido. So when they pass away, they go into the oblivion. What does it mean to go into the oblivion? The souls ultimately will be destroyed at a certain point, and there's no trace of their existence any longer. That's going to be the end of their reality. He pays his enemies in their lifetime, kedei lavido. So when they pass away, they go into the oblivion. That's the concept. The Gemara tells us, Talmud, that when we had a Sanhedrin, we had the High Court of Israel and the lower courts, they're empowered by the Torah to judge people for capital punishment. Not that it happened very often, but if a person should meet all the criteria to be deserving to be put to death, he will be put to death. There are 4 levels of death penalty. There's dying by stoning. Stoning doesn't mean the way they do it in Afghanistan. Doesn't mean that they pummel the body with stones. Doesn't mean that. The Talmud says, what does dying by stoning means? They take a person, they tie his hands and his feet, his hands behind him, his feet together, and they put him on an elevated platform, which is equivalent of his own height. And afterwards, they take him and they push him back or backwards. So he falls on his back. Since his hands are tied, he can't brace his fall. 99.9% of the times he breaks his neck, instantaneous death. He dies immediately. And then if he has any level of life in him, they take a stone, a heavy stone, they put it on his chest. But they do not destroy the body. Why did they destroy the body? Because the Torah says, "V'havta l'recha kamocha." You must love your fellow as you love yourself. To destroy the body is a total desecration of the human being. So therefore, you don't pummel the body with stones, but rather, as I said, if he doesn't die through breaking his neck, and if he does, they put the stone on him. That's dying. What's dying through burning? It doesn't mean they burn a person at the stake. Why? Because again, if you burn a person at the stake, that means it's a desecration of the body. You're destroying the body. You're incinerating the person. And the Torah says, "V'havta l'recha kamocha." You should love your fellow as love yourself. So when the person dies through burning, it doesn't mean you burn him in an inferno, but rather you take molten lead and you pour it down his throat. So the body's intact, but the person immediately, as the lead enters his body, he dies instantaneously. Okay, So the Talmud says that although today we no longer have a Sanhedrin, we no longer have a court that can actually render these kinds of verdicts to people to death, but the equivalent is still in effect. The equivalent of the four death penalties. We have four death penalties: stoning, burning, being killed by the sword, and strangulation. Those are the four levels of death penalty. So today, there's no stoning. So if a person is deserving to be stoned, how does Hashem make that person meet his fate? He falls off a roof. Just as when a person falls off this elevated platform, he falls to his death. Person falls off the roof, he falls to his death. If a person is deserving to die by burning, which is the molten lead, he's bit by a venomous snake. So the venom, when it goes through his body, it's almost instantaneous death. The venom. Person is supposed to die through strangulation. He dies through drowning. Drowning is asphyxiation. Person dies. Through the sword, either he's killed by a lion, because the main part, as we said, of the sword, or he's killed by the government. They have the guillotine. It's decapitation. Therefore, it's that. So even though it's not rendered by the court, but the person's fate, ultimately the person will meet that kind of fate. So the commentators ask a question on this Gemara. He says, we find people are truly evil, and they live till ripe old age without a worry in the world, and they die in peace in their beds. But according to the Talmud, if these people defiantly violated the Torah, why does God allow them to live this ripe old age in tranquility with all the amenities of life? So Tosas answers, the one who asked the question, that's the commentator on the page, answers, because the Torah tells us, the pasuk, the verse I just quoted, Mishalem l'sonav aponav lavido. God pays the reward to those his enemies in their lifetime, because when they passed away, they go into oblivion. These people truly are deserving. But any of the death penalties is atonement. Atonement means that you're atoned, so when you go to the world to come, you have a share in the world to come. These people were not meant to have a share in the world to come because they don't have an interest in it. Therefore, God gives them their due reward in this world. So when they pass away, they go into the oblivion. That's the answer which is given by the early commentators. That's how they reconcile what the Talmud says and what these people, the way they live their lives, why they're totally unaffected. That's what Tosas answers, okay? But nevertheless, we do find such a thing as tzaddik v'ralo. Rosh v'ralo. Person's evil, and he doesn't have a good day. And he doesn't live in peace and tranquility and wealth and everything else. What does that mean? So there's an interesting Orach Chaim HaKadosh here at the end of last week's reading. He asks a question. Grammatically, in Hebrew, you have singular, you have plural. In Hebrew, the word for enemy means sonei. Sonei is an enemy. If you want to say his enemy, it's son-o. That's what if it's plural, enemies, it's sonim. His enemies, son of. So the Torah says, Mishalem l'son of. God pays his enemies. Torah in plural. Now, how do you say face or their panim? How would you say their faces or their lives? Pneihem. So when it speaks about his enemies, it speaks in the plural. God pays his enemies al panov. Lavido, to destroy him. So Rochaim asks the question, the grammar is not consistent. We start enemies plural, and we speak about destroying the person, we speak about as an individual. Either start with the plural and end with the plural, or start with the singular and end with the singular. That's his question. He says something very interesting. He says, of course, God knows exactly all the generations that have been sent from a certain person, whether they be good or evil. You have a person who's evil, but yet he merits to have children or grandchildren that are tzaddikim, that are devoutly righteous. So he explains, God pays son of, plural. If God sees multiple generations coming from this person who are going to be his enemies, they're going to reflect the behavior of this person, then he pays that person in his lifetime to go into oblivion. Because he doesn't want that person to have a share in the world to come. Because he has nothing good coming from him. Not only is he evil, his descendants are going to be evil. If that's the case, pay him off, he has nothing in the world to come. What about if a person he himself is evil, but he will have descendants that are righteous? So it's not sown of. That person, God doesn't pay him off in this world. Why? Because God, since he has merit, that child is a descendant of his and does good, in the merit of that child, this evil person will have a share in the world to come. You understand? The person is not worthy in his own right. But because ultimately he's going to have a child who's special, down the pike, maybe 200 years later, that child will bring merit to him, that he's deserving to have a share in the world to come, and therefore that person will have divine punishment, ultimately to be reinstated in the world to come, in the merit of that child. That's why it's not in contradiction to reward and punishment. Because very often there are many things that have to take place to the rush of a tovlo. He may have to have a certain type of setting for his lifestyle to be able to have that child. Give you an example. Many years ago, the whole concept, I'm going back maybe 60 years ago, the concept or the reality of Baal Tshuva was unheard of. That a person was not an observant Jew, not even a traditional Jew, that he should come back to Judaism. Unheard of. Today, Baruch Hashem, since the 6-Day War, when there was this magnification of God's presence, it was a miracle, the war. 6 days, we destroyed all the Egyptian armies, all the Arab armies, so people were touched, and there was a shift. And that's when, in Israel, the Baal Tshuva movement really started very strongly. You had the Baal Tshuva yeshivas in Israel, whether it was Or Sameach, Eshet Torah, whatever it was, they all were launched then, because there was like a resurgence of Jewish identity. But before that, if you had Baal Tshuva, 10 in a generation was a lot. That's what it was. It was really unheard of. There was a person who lived in Germany. We know the Reform movement. It was strongest in Germany and Hungary. It started in the mid-18th century, in mid-19th century. German Jewry, from the year 1830 to the time of Rabbi Hirsch, 50% of German Jewry converted to Christianity. That's how strong the Reform movement was. The Reform instituted that marriages should take place in the temple. They call the synagogues temples. Why? Because just as the Christians, they marry their children in the church, they have to marry the children in the temple. Just as they have music in the church, they have an organ, you have to have music to accompany the service in the temple. They wanted to literally mimic the church. As a result of all this, not being able to discern much between the church and these temples, Reformed temples, 50% of German Jews, Reformed Jews, converted to Christianity within 30 years. 30 years. That's how overwhelming this effect was. Okay? In those days, you could not hold a position, like a public position, especially as a leadership, unless you had a doctorate. You had a PhD in something. And one of the great thinkers And the minds of the reform movement, his name was Dr. Birnbaum. Dr. Birnbaum, great philosopher. He was the pride and joy of the reform movement. In the 1880s, all of a sudden, he came out with a statement refuting Reform Judaism to literally turn it to worthlessness. They were shocked. It's unheard of. A man who's so prominent and a reformer, a leader in the reform movement, he should turn to change his allegiance. Firstly, they felt they were betrayed, but besides that, it was unheard of. And he went, it caused tremendous damage to the reform movement because he had credibility among the greatest intellectuals of the generation, philosophy, and he himself says Reform Judaism has no basis for it. The only way to go is Orthodox Judaism. That's the only Judaism that has to do with divinity. Everything else is nothing. That's what he said. This person, Dr. Birnbaum, if his father was a Reform Jew and was thriving, say it doesn't make any sense. If there's a reform, if there's one punishment, this man should be taken out. His father, his grandfather, and he was raised in a very upscale culture with all the amenities. You know why? Because if he wouldn't have had that background and that upbringing, as he did, secular education, someone else, to become who he became wouldn't have been possible. You understand? Guy goes to PS 96. Okay, what is it going to be? Person goes to a private school where you pay tuition when another guy earns a salary for a year. That's something special. But you realize the quality of education is different quality education. As a result of that, there's the sophistication, there's the intellectualism. You never know what that intellectual, what that will bring for that child eventually. Although his parents are disconnected, does make a difference. And this only God knows. God only knows what the future will bring. Not that God has any bearing on that person's choice, but nevertheless, he knows what the end of the story is going to be. Therefore, he provides in advance many settings and amenities for that person to ultimately to evolve and become what he becomes in the future. So, Mishalim, the son of Alponav Lavido, God pays his enemies in his presence, in his lifetime. We're going from public, plural to singular. The answer is enemies is referring to the people he will father, the generations they'll emanate from. If he sees all those enemies, all those generations are bad generations, God will pay him off. He will not have any reward. Because he has no value versus the future. But the person that he himself may be an evil person. But he himself doesn't even know who his child or grandchild will be. They may be devout Jews. As a result of that, God will punish him in this world, that he should have a share in the world to come, in the merit of that grandchild that ultimately is going to come back. There's a famous story. I had a relationship with this person. You know, Ben Gurion was the first prime minister of Israel. David Ben Gurion. And he himself did not believe in God. He was a bad man. Even though, according to Jewish history, the founder of, first prime minister of Israel, was a tough guy. He was pompous. You can't imagine. Read about him. And originally, when the state was founded, there was a compulsory conscription into the Israeli army. Men and women. Men and women. Women are going to be conscripted. There was a great rabbi who came to Israel in 1934. His name was Avram Yishai Karelitz, known as the Chazon Ish. He ultimately became the leading Torah sage in the world, And he said, no observant woman will be conscripted into the Israeli army. It's a breach of her modesty. She cannot, it's inappropriate. women will not be conscripted. Okay, and there is a divinity exemption. Person studies Torah should not be. Ben Gurion never had anybody oppose him about anything, and if they did, he was crushed them. So in 1933 or 34, and he realizes he just can't push aside the Chazon Ish. He was known as the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Karelitz. And he has to have a meeting with him. And who he feels with his power of persuasion, he'll convince him that they should be conscripted. He didn't know who he was coming against. The Chazon Ish didn't weigh 100 pounds. He's a man who invested every fiber of his being in Torah. He was a very holy man, but intelligent beyond intelligent. His genius was one of a kind. And those years in the 30s, Tel Aviv Bnei Brak was sand dunes. That's all it was, sand dunes. One day, this black limousine pulls up at the Chazon Ish's house. It's the secretary of Ben Gurion, and he's coming to speak to Ben Gurion to set an appointment for Ben Gurion to come see the Chazon Ish. Ben Gurion's going to travel from Yerushalayim, from Jerusalem to Bnei Brak to see the Chazon Ish. Knocks on the door, comes in, introduces himself as the prime minister's personal secretary, and he's coming to make an appointment for David Ben Gurion. So the Chazon Ish says, he says, when can we have an appointment? He says, my house is open 24 hours a day to any Jew who wants to come through my doors. He doesn't need an appointment. He's no different than any other Jew. Any other Jew can come anytime during a 24-hour period. My door's open. The prime minister can come anytime he wants. This personal secretary hears the words of this fanatical, ancient, archaic Jew saying that Ben Gurion is no different than any other visitor visiting his house. As any other visitor comes through the door 24 hours a day, Ben Gurion could come with the pack. He's referring to Ben Gurion as the pack. He's livid. Gets back to Ben Gurion and tells him, did you hear what the rabbi said? The audacity, lack of respect is you could come like everybody else could come. He wasn't impressed that you want to come see him. You hear what he's upset about, okay? So one day, Ben Gurion came to us to see the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish, Ben Gurion knew Tanakh, Bible, prophets, and scripture. He had it committed to memory almost. And he thought he's a great Talmud Chochem. Because many people don't know it. But did he ever study Mishnah? Did he ever study Talmud? He didn't study anything. But he thought the little bit of knowledge he has, since it's more than most, he's a great Torah sage. And he could stand up against people like the Chazon Ish. He got into a conversation with the Chazon Ish. It's not only his knowledge, his level of clarity, his level of forcefulness. This little man who weighed less than 100 pounds, he was like amazed with his genius. And the end of the meeting was, he agreed that if a person could prove his level of observance of Judaism, and if it's determined that he's Orthodox, he's exempt. The 4D status. Divinity status, exemption. It's an exemption, okay? So the Chazon Ish comes back from Bnei Brak, and he shares his experience with the inner circle. So I wanted to tell you, so the secretary was livid. Man's compares, he says, you don't understand. That's the man I respect. The man who's not impressed with even the prime minister, and he says, I'm no different than anybody else coming through his doors. That's the man I want to meet. That's what Gurion said about Chazon Ish. He gets back after the meeting. He was like amazed. He was touched, never saw such genius. And this man, although he seems to be, should have been a backward type person. So he comes back, and one of his inner circle, who wasn't observant at all, secular Jew, but this person's wife lit Shabbos candles. And we know that a woman lit Shabbos candles, she prays for her children. She should have special children. So after her husband comes home, he says, Ben Gurion came back from this meeting with this holy rabbi, and he says he's never met such a rabbi before. And he's really special. He's one of a kind. That's why Ben-Gurion shared with his inner circle of friends in the cabinet. And this person was the minister of education. Okay, so the woman, she hears this from her husband, and she says to her husband, until now, I prayed, they didn't have children yet, that our children should be like Ben-Gurion, because she's the hero, he's the hero. But after hearing that Ben-Gurion says the Chazon Ish is the hero, I pray we should have grandchildren like Chazon Ish. Yeah, there's a secular woman. The only thing she keeps in Judaism, she lights Shabbos candles. Okay? Does she know what the Chazon Ish is? If Ben-Gurion's impressed with him, that's got a grandson I want to have. Okay? Fast forward about 40 years later, 45, person comes to my office. His name is Hyman. That's his family name, Hyman. His grandmother or mother was a daughter of this person, of this secular person, whose wife lit Shabbos candles. So she said, when I thought Ben-Gurion was the greatest, I prayed my children should be like Ben-Gurion. But now that I see that even Ben-Gurion esteems and reveres this holy rabbi, if that's the case, I want my children to be like the Chazon Ish. So how was she cursed? She had a grandson that became a chassid, studied in yeshiva, and that was the outcome. Would you ever believe a man who's within Ben-Gurion's cabinet his grandson should be a Baal Tshuva? With all the settings of what Baal Tshuva looks like, you never believe it. So again, do we know what's coming down the pike? Do we know what? So, Mishalem the son of Levi, though, if God sees that not only is this person so-called an enemy of his, because he's evil, but even his grandchildren are the same, God pays him off, and he's gone forever. But if he sees that he's going to have a special grandchild, God doesn't destroy him in the merit of the grandchild, the great-grandchild. And therefore, he doesn't go into the oblivion, he has a share in the world to come. This is the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, based on his Kabbalistic interpretation of this. That's what it is. There's a famous word I once said over there in the Chofetz Chaim. The Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos that schar b'ha'el maleka, that the innate value of mitzvah is so infinite, as many years as you live, even qualitative years, you cannot be compensated for the reward of even one mitzvah. Because a mitzvah is eternity, the world is finite in every sense of the word. Therefore, it's impossible to be rewarded in this world. So the Chofetz Chaim asks, and it's Rabbi Yisrael Ksalanta's question, so how do we understand this verse? Meshalem l'son of upon Avida, God pays off his enemies, the evil person in this world, so he's going to the oblivion. But if we're saying as much as you paid off in this world, it's a pittance compared to what the innate value of that is. He can never be paid off in his lifetime. So why does the Torah say? Hashem says, I will pay them off in their lifetime, that they should go into the oblivion. That's the question which is asked initially by Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter answers it this way. Chofetz Chaim is totally different. He says, a person goes into a restaurant, looks at the menu, main course, sirloin steak, $90,000. The person has suitcases, satchels filled with $100 bills. He says, not a problem. He calls his driver, John, bring me the satchel. Peels off $90,000, pays for the main course. Other thing, how much is dessert? $25,000. Not a problem. It's insanity. That kind of money, do you know what you can do with that kind of money? You could save lives. You could feed thousands of people. And for one main course, you're paying that kind of money. The proprietor is taking advantage of the customer. No, he's not. What you want, he gives you. And price is not a question. Whatever the price is, I pay that price. So that's Rabbi Yisrael. Since the Russia doesn't believe in God, he doesn't want to have a relationship with God, regardless of the value of the mitzvah, he'll take a pittance. He'll take a nickel on $1 trillion. Because that's what he wants. He wants this world. He wants to stuff his face. He wants to live as a hedonist. Hedonist of him is the world to come. If that's the case, God says it. But you realize you're shortchanging yourself. Doesn't make a difference. If a person wants to be shortchanged, he's shortchanged. Is there a tremendous balance? The answer is yes. But he says, you know something? I'll sign on the check paid in full. Once you sign and paid in full, God has no obligation to you any longer. That's schar by, even though schar by alam and leko, there's no reward in this world. But if the person rejects the world to come, and you're willing to take a penny on $1, or a penny on $100, or $1,000, God says that's your prerogative. Although it has nothing to do with the innate value of the mitzvah that you perform. So he says, and he explains with an allegory, the Chofetz Chaim, phenomenal allegory. This person was a forger, professional forger, and he goes and forges $10,000 ruble notes, which would be recognized by the Russian treasury. So he forges these notes. You look at them, you couldn't tell the difference between a real note and this forged note, the Russian note. And he figures no bank has enough cash on hand. He can go straight to the Treasury Department. He'll present his satchel of money, $1,000 notes, $5,000 notes, whatever they are. He comes into the Minister of the Treasury, and he says, you know, I have these very big notes, $10,000 notes, $50,000 notes. I want to cash them in for gold. He says, no problem. Could you show me some of the notes? He shows him the notes. He picks it up to the light, looks at it. He says, you know something? If you don't leave this room in 5 minutes, I'm putting you before a firing squad. Where do you have the audacity to bring forged notes to the treasury and try to pass them off as real currency? He says to the treasurer, he says, why is it forgery? They're authentic notes. Take a look at it. They're a real note. He says, you're talking to me. I'm the expert. I'm telling you they're forgeries. He says, prove it. He says, I'll prove it to you. A note that's an authentic note has the watermark on the note is the watermark of the czar. Your note, although print-wise, it's perfect. One thing's lacking. It's lacking the imprint, the watermark of the czar. That means it's a false note. It's counterfeit. It's not a real note. So the Chofetz Chaim explains it this way. If a person does a mitzvah for the sake of God, or because God commanded him to do the mitzvah, so what imprint does that mitzvah have? What was the impetus to do that mitzvah? God. If God's imprints on that, that's the watermark of the master of the universe. It has infinite worth. That note cannot be paid off in this world. What about the person, he loves dogs. He loves horses. And he always has a few sugar cubes and a few apples in his pocket. He loves them. Why does he love them? Because as a human being, he loves them. That's called humanitarian. When it's humanitarian, that kind of reward to be paid off in this world. If the reason why I'm doing it is because God commanded me to, so that means the profile of that mitzvah and that chesed is a spiritual profile. Once it takes on that spiritual connotation, there's not enough time in this world to be able to live those amenities. That's done, but something that's done purely out of it emanates from your humanitarianism. That's where it comes from. That's the paper without the watermark. Without the watermark, it's worth a pittance, or it's maybe not even worth the paper it's printed on. That's the Chofetz Chaim. That's Mishal the son of Avinu. God pays off his enemies in their lifetime that he's going to oblivion. But what about they did all this good? But that good doesn't warrant eternity. It warrants a reward. It could be 20 years, 50 years of what? Of wealth. But at least over there, the person's doing it, but it's short-lived, relatively speaking. Okay, we're going to stop here.